Welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Christophe Robit. To be or not to be in the European Union, that's the question on David Cameron's mind. The British Prime Minister has vowed to renegotiate his country's relationship with Europe and put the New Deal to voters in an in-out referendum after the next general election, providing, of course, the British Prime Minister does win the next election. I'm joined here at the French Institute for International Relations by David Lidington. He's the UK Minister for Europe. Welcome to our programme.
Thank you.
Now, to make things clear to our viewers, Britain is not a member of the Eurozone. You're not in the Schengen area. You have a number of opt-outs, and Britain recently vetoed the so-called fiscal pact. Why this need to renegotiate your place in Europe?
Because we think that there's some big challenges that face Europe as well as the UK in terms of its place within the European Union. There's huge public mistrust of the EU. In the UK, certainly, the Prime Minister described public consent for our membership as wafer thin. But you see, looking around Europe, whether you look in France, whether you look in Spain, in parts of southeastern Europe now, the support for anti-European populist forces in some countries, neo-fascist forces, has grown stronger, partly, not entirely, but partly because of resentment at how EU decisions are taken. So there's a big problem there. And we think Europe needs to be much more competitive, more growth-friendly than it is now. It needs to be more flexible and diverse, accepting that different countries will want to pursue different levels of integration, and also more democratically accountable, with a stronger voice for national parliaments than it has today.
And very concretely, what sort of powers do you want to repatriate to London?
We want to see reforms that all European countries feel happy with. And David Cameron, when he made his keynote speech on the future of Europe earlier this year, made it clear that he wasn't coming with a list of British demands or British opt-outs. He wanted Europe to come together to deal with the challenges of a loss of competitiveness, inflexibility, public discontent, lack of democratic accountability. And it would be very much a second best if he had to come forward and say, look, we want this for the UK. But if we can get the right settlement for Europe as a whole, then we will have a Europe with which the British people are likely to feel a great deal more comfortable and which they're likely to be willing to support come a referendum.
But Cameron's partners have made it clear, they've said there won't be an a la carte settlement for Britain. How confident are you that you will manage to convince your partners?
Well, I think you look for a start at what has happened since the present British government has come to office, that we have had agreements to reform fundamentally the common fisheries policy in a way that British governments have asked for decades, to ban the obscene practice of discarding good fish, to shift fisheries to more local and regional management. And the Commission has championed this with our very active and vocal support. We have seen, for the first time ever, a reduction in the EU's multi-annual budget, the financial framework. Again, that was something where my Prime Minister worked hand in glove with other European leaders. We have seen agreement last year of all 28 heads of government for the exemption of the smallest businesses, micro businesses, from new European regulations. Now, I think we need to go further. There is still too much, too detailed and burdensome regulation on business, particularly on small and medium-sized enterprises.
Give us very concrete examples.
Yes, we've had this week a report to David Cameron from British business leaders who've consulted widely, not just in the UK, but across Europe. Organisations like MEDEF have fed their views through into this business leaders report, and that's saying things like the REACH directive on chemicals needs to be simplified to make it more business-friendly, less expensive and complicated for businesses to apply, that we need to look at how things like waste management regulations bear upon very small enterprises that are shipping things like garden waste that are no threat to anybody in very small quantities, so that we don't burden European business down unnecessarily with paperwork and bureaucracy that our competitors elsewhere in the world don't have to contend with, because what we need is more jobs in Europe, more growth in Europe to get those millions of young people back into work.
You referred to this report that was handed in by a number of British business leaders to the Prime Minister, a very critical report where they say, look, the EU rules cost Europe billions of euros each year. Do you agree with that assessment? Because a lot of people in Germany and France don't agree at all. They will tell you if it weren't for Europe, we wouldn't be able to allow countries like Spain, Greece, Portugal to become more competitive.
Well, no one is saying that we should do away with all regulation, all social protection. Yeah, I mean, the idea that, you know, what we want is to send little boys up chimneys again to sweep them clean is a nonsense. But what you do need to do is have regulations that are smarter, that are more business friendly than they are at the moment. And I'd emphasise this report is the voice of business. And it's not just UK business. This is business organisations and business leaders in France and Germany and other European countries that have contributed to the report that's gone into David Cameron today. And I talked to my German opposite numbers. I talked to ministers from around the European Union, Scandinavia, from France. Yes, they want proper social protection, but they also recognise that we need to free our businesses to create more jobs and to generate wealth and economic growth. If we don't do that, the next generation of Europeans won't be able to afford the standard of living or the social protection we take for granted today.
Meanwhile, not all business leaders in Britain agree with this report. I remember, for instance, that Sir Richard Branson earlier this year sent a letter to your Prime Minister saying, look, this referendum issue is very dangerous and could be counterproductive.
But that's a different issue. I mean, different leaders of business will have different views on the referendum. I happen to think the referendum is necessary to settle this debate in the United Kingdom definitively in a way that will not be possible through any other
And what happens if British voters say, no, we don't want to stay in the European Union?
You abide by the democratic verdict of voters. I mean, there is risk in democracy. If you're going to do away with all uncertainty and risk, you do away with democracy. Would
that be your nightmare scenario for Britain?
It's not something I or my Prime Minister would welcome. What the Prime Minister says he wants is for Britain to stay in a European Union which has successfully reformed itself so it's more competitive and prosperous, more democratic, more flexible than it is today. You go back to what the business leaders were telling David Cameron this week, in some respects, they were saying, and we in the British government have consistently argued, you need more Europe in some areas. You need to break through some of the national barriers that still stop European services from developing in the way that they need to do. If you look at France and the UK, it is services that is now the predominant part of both our economies. We've got manufacturing sectors of roughly the same size, big service and growing services sectors. At the moment, we don't have a proper single market in services across Europe. The proposal on digital are a step forward to achieving that, but there's still far too many national restrictive practices, for example, regulated professions, and we need to make sure there is a level playing field for businesses to compete across Europe.
Now, history has shown that referendums on Europe are very risky. We remember the Netherlands, France, Ireland. Aren't you afraid that British voters will use this referendum for other reasons, maybe to punish your government?
I think that if the arguments are put before people plainly and on the basis of evidence, then people will take a rational, informed choice. They feel that this is a very important decision about the future of the United Kingdom. I mean, it's an old British conservative principle. Winston Churchill himself first articulated, you have to trust the people at the end of the day. And I think when governments don't trust their electorates, you actually build up more problems for the future. One of the problems, when I look back, one of the problems we have in the UK now over our relationship with the EU is that we've had treaty after treaty come through. Usually some additional powers have gone to EU institutions. And the British people have not been asked to give their consent to this by way of a popular vote. And they've looked next door in Ireland, and they've seen our neighbours in Ireland have had referendums. They've looked at what we have done in the UK with Scottish devolution, Welsh devolution, whether or not to change the voting system for the House of Commons 2 years ago. we've had referendums to settle big constitutional issues. I think this is the one way to settle the argument for good in the UK.
When you look at the polls, we know there is a big problem for the Conservative Party with UKIP, the anti-Euro UK Independence Party. When you look at the figures, the more David Cameron turns his back on Europe, the more they keep on rising. Aren't his tactics just counterproductive?
What the polls say is that when people are asked if David Cameron comes back from Europe and asks you to endorse a better deal on the back of his negotiations, how would you vote? You get a decisive majority who say, well, in those circumstances, I would vote to stay in. And I think the underlying wish of most people in the UK is in line with the Prime Minister's, which is to stay in the European Union, but be confident that the European Union is more prosperous, competitive, democratic than it is nowadays, less intrusive into some of the things that really ought to be left to be settled at national or even at regional and local level than is the case today. I mean, look at UKIP. I mean, what the polls tell me is that even for UKIP voters, Europe is not the most important issue that drives their votes. It's more about economic discontent and about migration than about EU membership.
So you aren't afraid that you will open a Pandora's box? David Lidington, thank you very much for talking to us. I remind our viewers that you are the UK Europe Minister. And thank you for watching this edition of The Interview on France 24. Goodbye.